Good morning, everybody.
Morning.
Oh, Reverend Lynn is here today. It's good seeing everybody. Well, seeing you online at least. Hello.
No,
Hello.
Reverend, is that you?
Yeah, we've got Reverend Lynn here today. It's been a while.
Yeah.
Are you feeling good, Reverend Lynn? Are you there? Oh, hello. Can't hear. Reverend Lynn, can you hear us? I don't hear you. If you're on, if you're on, say something. No, I know you're on. Rosemary, you can hear it, right?
I can hear you, but for some reason my video isn't working.
Oh, well, that's not good. We got people coming in. I'm making sure we're streaming right now. We are. We're streaming. Uh, yeah, there's Micah. There's everybody coming in. Micah's here. He's here. He's a, he's here. And we are up and recording and got people from different places. Let me just see. Is your video working now, Rosemary?
Um, it's apparently not, and I don't know why.
Hmm.
It says built-in camera is checked, and like, get out of this and go to settings, or maybe quit Zoom and come back.
Yeah. We can hear you, but we don't, yeah.
All right. Uh, let me try logging out and coming back in.
We'll get you back in. Good morning, everybody. Good morning.
Sarah had a question for me this morning. She said, "Well,
Oh,
ask Mark." Hello. Was what's the earliest archaeology evidence that we have of the Jews being in Egypt? Is it
uh,
the steel that they say the Hebrews?
so yeah, there is. So the question is, what's the earliest? Uh, I'll show you this text that we have, but it's not. Uh, Here's the Merneptah stele. So this is from sometime in the 1200s, right?
Mhm.
So what is interesting about this, again, it was discovered in 1896, so right around the turn of the last century, they found it. And here's what it says. It talks about Egyptian conquest of Canaan. And so it talks about um, places that the Egyptians conquered. So it says, plundered is the Canaan with every evil, carried off is Ascalon, seized upon is Gezer. We know where that is. Yenoam, we're not exactly sure, but where we think Yenoam is, but it's in Israel right here. It's perhaps by the Yarmouk River. Also, it could be in the Hula Valley in northern Israel, but not exactly sure where Yenoam is, but it's definitely an Israeli, Syrian, that kind of area. Uh, yeah, sorry. And then Israel is laid waste, its seed is no more. So what's interesting about that is that it refers to Israel, but it's not Israel in Egypt, it's Egypt in Israel.
Mhm.
What's interesting about that is that, again, here's the here it is in hieroglyphics. And um, perhaps it's referring to the Jezreel Valley, which is in Israel. right? It's in the area around Megiddo. And then it's also maybe this other reference to people that live in Libya in northern Africa. So what's obviously important about this is that it's the first extra biblical reference to ancient Israel that we find. But again, it's a little problematic because if this area is called Israel by 1200, Moses was taking the people out of Egypt around that time. So it's kind of, it's a little problematic because is it already called Israel by 1200? And if it is, why are the Egyptians referring it to Israel at a time when it was still in the process of being conquered? But, you know, I mean, most people think that it's Israel, that the word that's used in the text is Israel. So it's the earliest reference to a person, but the place Israel. But again, it's not in Egypt. These are not Israelites living in Egypt. We don't have texts that confirm that the Israelites were in Egypt. But
And this is called, what's the name of the stone again?
Merneptah stele.
Oh, let me see. Merneptah.
Merneptah stele.
And is this the one that is in the museum in London that you go and visit?
No. This one's in, you can see it. It's in the Cairo. It's in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. So you can see it. I mean, it's on display. So you can see it. It's a very important element of biblical archaeology. But again, you know, it raises some questions. And again, I mean, you know, you have to be careful when you have like one reference in one text to make bigger claims from it. But you know, it is significant. So, you know, for people who say, well, Israel's all made up, you know, we don't know King David, for example, you know, existed for sure. You know, the earliest archaeological evidence for people that lived in the Bible is the Tel Dan fragment that we have, that we discovered from the time of the kings, from about 850, and then also the references in the Mesha stele to the Israelite kings and the Judite kings that he references. Those are roughly from around the same period, from about 2,900 years ago. So those are the earliest references that prove that there were these people that lived. And they're pretty consistent with what we have, by the way, but we don't have much beyond that. Occasionally, like again, the Merneptah stele, you know, there's people who, right here, it says right here, the others being the Tel Dan, the one I was mentioning, and this, which again, from this period of time, from the time of Shalmaneser, Battle of Karkar, describes Israel, and this is in the British Museum. So.
Oh, that's okay. That's the one that you always go visit.
Yeah, but this one's not the one. This is not the main one, though. The main one is the one that actually is from a later period. It's from about 100 years later, and that is the Lachish tablets. And those are also from around the same time, from the Assyrian period. But those ones actually have pictures of our people. I mean, that's like almost photographic evidence of our people. But that's about 100 years later. But this one again, possibly refers to King Ahav of the Northern Kingdom. So yeah, these are all important pieces of evidence, and they are older. If I turn back here to Micah, they're a little bit older. Some of the earliest evidence that we have, archaeological evidence, is from before Micah. So Micah lives around 720 or 730, before the destruction of the north. He's warning about the destruction of the north, but he's before the actual event. And so he's writing from around the same period of time. I just want to say one thing since Gail brought it up. We have to be careful that just because we don't have archaeological evidence for something that happened 3,000 years ago doesn't mean it didn't happen. That doesn't mean that everything in the Bible I'm saying happened and we don't have archaeological evidence and therefore we have to say it happened. But on the other hand, just because we don't have archaeological evidence for it doesn't mean we can say it didn't happen. Again, to be able to recover, historical evidence, archaeological evidence that, confirms something that happened 3,000 years ago is very, very hard to find. Like beyond the needle in the haystack, it's almost impossible. But when it happens, everybody says, well, we haven't found this or we haven't found that, because it's almost impossible to find it. The fact that we found one thing is kind of a miracle. So just understand that, that's the situation. And remember the Merneptah, the Merneptah stela, which was in Egypt, like until we were able to decipher hieroglyphics and until the Rosetta Stone, I mean, it was there, we just couldn't read it. So in some cases, we didn't have the ability to read or comprehend what we were looking at. So remember, that's part of it too, is that, as we get smarter and know where to look for things or are able to decipher certain things, we might have information that we're sitting on that we just don't even realize that we were sitting on it. So just keep that in mind too. Just because we haven't found it yet doesn't mean that it's not real. You can say, hey, look, we don't have confirmation of it. I'm always honest and tell people we don't have confirmation on something, but at the same time, it doesn't mean that it didn't happen. That's another step that you have to go. But again, I think it says more about your political and religious and kind of like your own psychology that that people go to these extremes of it did happen until you prove it wrong, or it didn't happen until you prove it did. I try to take a little bit in the middle, which is like, hey, every time people say that we know everything, turns out we don't know everything. So you have to have a little humility when it comes to this stuff. So, and that's definitely, by the way, one of the themes for Micah, humility. So last week we
hey Rabbi, I have two follow-up questions to that. I think it's perfect because I was actually thinking about it this morning. The first one is, what archaeological evidence, even though we just discussed it, cross-checks to the Torah, to the Old Testament, that names Israel at the top. What's the earliest reference of Israel that's cross-checked to archaeological evidence?
That one, the Merneptah stele that we just looked at from 1200.
Okay, all right, and what year was that?
1200. 1200
Okay.
BC. So that's 3,200 years ago. It's from roughly the time of Moses.
Okay, all right. So, all right, I just want to make sure I got that and it didn't fly over my head. My second question is a bit deeper, in that we know that that fake news or misinformation is not a new phenomenon, right?
Yeah.
That it goes back to probably the beginning of man, right? How do we know what we're reading? The ancient, and it doesn't actually mean any of the text that we're reading is really what happened. How do we know that that this isn't misinformation that started from the earliest of time?
So I just had this conversation with somebody recently regarding the Exodus and Passover coming up. And so I will summarize what I was explaining to this person, and kind of what I've explained to my own family and the way I understand it. And again, this understanding that this is the way that I've come to terms with it, though I have an interesting thing to add to this, which is, okay, the whole concept of verifying the factual basis for things is actually a fairly new phenomenon, because until we had video and photos, and before that, like daguerreotypes, the earliest photographic image of something changed what the way we thought about information, which is it can be verified, that we actually can see a picture of something, hear a recording of somebody's voice, and know that that actually happened, right? So for the last about 150 years, that's it. That's what we've been asking ourselves those questions. Our ancestors didn't ask those questions. They didn't do that because there was no way to verify something. And so they didn't really, it's just the way you look at the world, right? It's not a matter of, well, where's the proof? They weren't going to get proof. And so nobody kind of formulated something around those ideas of facts, right? So what we were left with, though, was this idea that there was a truth to what was said, right? So we don't have the verifiable facts that the Exodus happened, which is critical for our understanding of who we are. And people have had this is a major issue. Every few years, some rabbi or somebody comes out and says, the Exodus probably never happened, that we have no archaeological evidence for it. The numbers seem too great. It just doesn't seem like it happens. And of course, everybody cuts off what their point was, which is that the story is still important. It's still very important for who we are. Okay. So they always cut out that other part. I mean, I remember when this really hit was like about 25 years ago, David Wolpe, the rabbi from Sinai Temple, who was, one of the most well-known rabbis in the country. He's a conservative rabbi. He came out and said the Exodus probably never happened. Now, he said, that being said, it's so important for who we are. And we tell this story for so many reasons and why we need to tell the story. But everyone, all they heard was, rabbi says Exodus never happened. And that was the headline. Now, I don't make pronouncements like that because to me, that I know what's going to happen. I know everyone's going to blow up the first part. But what I always tell people is, when it comes to the Exodus, I say this, and I've talked to biblical scholars, historians, people who have made similar points. Who makes up a story like the Exodus? Not for the fact that God rescues us and does miracles for us, but who makes up a story that their ancestors were slaves? If you're going to make up a story about your ancestors, it's that they were amazing people who were giants, who were strong, who were powerful, who had special powers, who nobody could conquer. But the idea that our ancestors were slaves and we talk about it indicates to me at some level that if you're going to make up a story, you don't make up that story. So I believe that there's a truth to that story just based on the fact of who makes up a story like that. So that's my who makes up a story like that argument for that.
But Mark, by the same token, 2 points. By the same token, who wouldn't make up a story that says we started as slaves and look where we are now?
I know what you're saying because
right?
because that's what we do today. That's the rags to riches story. Okay.
Right.
We love those stories. By the way, our country, the United States, is built on those stories.
Built on rags to riches.
That's the Horatio Alger, the mythology of America. Okay. That's critical for our understanding. But Judith, that never existed and hasn't existed anywhere else in the world. Nobody else's legends are like that. We can come to ask that question is based on the fact that you were born and raised in America, where we love those kind of stories. People didn't have those kind of stories because even in the stories, which were the typical, again, this is what Campbell writes about. Joseph Campbell writes about the mythology, the archetypes. Even in the stories where the hero turns out, to be a hero, and he started at a lower level, it's that he was really gifted from the beginning, raised by poor people or raised by not his real parents, the Hercules myth.
Hercules
myth. To some extent, the reverse of the Moses story. But those heroic stories, those aren't our stories, which again, if that's possible, that we just invented a story, we're the only people in the world who invented the story of this. And is it possible? Yeah, but it's not likely, because what people tend to do is they write stories that are similar to the stories around them, right? So they're just, I don't want to say they're lazy, but they're conformists. Like everybody writes
That's
those
because that's
stories.
what sells.
And that's what we did. We did that. We know we
Right.
did it in other places. Our flood story is we found it in the Epic of Gilgamesh. When we found the flood story in other places, we're like, oh, dang, that's really our story. When we read
Right.
these Psalms from Ugarit in Phoenicia and said, oh my gosh, that's Psalm 52. Like we said to ourselves, we copied stuff. And so we know we copy stuff, but like copying that story defies logic. And so for me,
Right.
that's, again, is it possible? Absolutely. But it's
Right.
not likely. And the likelihood is that there was some element of our servitude in Egypt that was a foregone conclusion. We do have Egyptian versions of ours, of us being slaves, but they're very late, right? So they were written around the 1st century. And so by then they could have been copying our story. And so we don't
Right.
put a lot of stock into the Egyptian versions of being slaves, because there were versions of that, but they're very unreliable. And so we tend to discount the Egyptian testimony to it, because first of all, we don't have the entire story. We have it that as it was kept by Philo and by Josephus, who wrote about how Egyptians made fun of us because they said we were slaves that left Egypt, that we were lepers, we were
Right.
loser outcasts that left Egypt. But it's also possible that they didn't know and they were just playing on their stories, and we only have them from our side. So
Right.
we have the for example, Josephus wrote this short book called Contra Appionum, which is against one of the Egyptian propagandists who was making fun of Jews, but we have his side. We don't exactly know what Appionum said, only what Josephus picked on. And so we know that the Egyptians were demeaning us by saying, you're loser Egyptians that left, we threw you out, whatever. But we don't know that there's any evidence that they were drawing off of an Egyptian story. So I that's why I don't bring it up, because it's not very good evidence that the Egyptians have of us being slaves in their own country, because it happened over 1,000 years later, and it seems like they're riffing on our own stories. That being said,
my other point was for John. You always have to remember that history is written by the victors. If you look at at ancient texts and not so ancient texts as quote unquote fact as opposed to truth, there are no women, there are no minority, you know what I mean? So I think anything written, again, without that video, and even with the video proof or verification, there's huge portions that weren't there to begin with, so it's not fact anyway.
Yeah. So that's the split between what I call fact and truth. I always tell people the least factual book of the Bible, factual, is the book of Esther that we just celebrated at Purim. I mean, there's nothing factual about that story. It is the closest thing to a fairy tale that we have. However, it's one of the most truthful books, because it's been repeated over and over again in Jewish history, where Jews barely survived a pogrom. Jews happened to have a guy at the right place at the right time, or a woman at the right place at the right time, who intervened and was able to help us. Whether it was Jacobson helping Truman understand why Israel had to be established, or whether it was some guy who worked in the court in some country in Europe who put in a good word, whose grandparents were Jewish, who happened to be at the right place. I mean, like, there's so many versions of that. There's 90 versions of Purims in Eastern Europe, in shtetls throughout Ukraine and Russia, where they had their own version of Purim. They had their own version of being saved at the last minute. 90 that we have records of. So is it not true? Well, I don't know. It seems pretty true to me. It seems like when I read that story, it reminds me that there are people who are 100% convinced that they have to destroy us. So it's a very factual It's a very factual story to me, but I mean, very truthful story, but not a very factual story. Same thing with Jonah. I mean, nothing in Jonah that we just read a couple weeks ago, is factual other than there was a guy named Jonah. But the story is tremendously true. It's got some profound truths in it that we talked about that really hit home, especially now. But here's the last thing I want to say about this, though, and this is my modern and my new thing that I have come to terms with, or am coming to terms with. But I tell people this. Think about it for a second. We're getting back to a point where video and photographic evidence will mean nothing.
Yep.
We are getting back to a point now with AI and deep fake and everything else, where if somebody shows you a video, we're getting very close to a point where people say, how do I know that video is real? Okay. So when that happens, when video and maybe for our kids or for our grandkids, when they look at a video and say, what's that? My kid can do that. When we get to that point where there's no longer any verifiable, or where we feel there's verifiable factual evidence that something happened, that's going to completely obliterate this system that we've had for the last 200 years, where people say, well, if I see it, I believe it. If I can see a video of it, then I know what happened. People are no longer going to have, they don't even now, but eventually, I mean, we still crave that. We still want to see it. But there's going to be a point where people who are raised from the moment that they understood things, right, since their ability to have conscious and reflective thought, where they say, but I know that there's false videos. I know that like people do these things all the time, and they know that that's the world that they live in. What are we not going to go back to this point where people are going to say, well, I don't know that it's factual, but it's true.
Yeah, but you'll still have testimony under oath of unimpeachable credibility. So
yeah, but how are you and I are going to say,
who are we going to believe? Who are we going to believe is actually telling fact?
Yeah. I mean, John,
you have multiple corroboration. And you have to decide.
I'm telling you, yes, but the fact that you have to decide now, John, this was not something that people thought about 30 or 40 years ago. If Walter Cronkite reported on it, they believed it happened.
I understand that. I understand things change.
It's done. But John, that's done. We're dinosaurs walking around with an understanding of it. I'm telling you, kids are going to be born. The kids being born right now are not going to have that same, they are not going to enter the world with the thought that something that they see on television or on their phone or that they saw on video is real. They'll think somebody created it.
I understand, but getting back to what I understand that, I'll stipulate, I agree. That's just, but getting back to what Judith said, that we've been discussing, that history is indeed authored by the victors, but there is a loser side of the story, right? And so there are two sides or three sides to a story. So my whole question is I just can't have blind faith, and I don't understand people that do have blind faith.
I agree, John. I 100% agree with you. That's why Judaism provides us with less certainty than other faiths. It's a challenge. I mean, I talk to people about it all the time, especially people that convert to Judaism. I have to remind them that, yeah, it's going to be tougher because you're going to have to figure this out. I can't tell you. I mean,
isn't that the meaning of faith? Believing in something that can't be proved?
Yes, but there are some people, even obviously within the Jewish world, who have what John described more as blind faith, as less, less willingness or less feeling less need to verify and to have it proved to them to some extent, however you want to understand it, what people are willing to accept without evidence or without I mean, yes, what they're willing to take on faith. I think on one hand, and I've said this before, Judaism has less requirements for faith in the sense of like, in order to be Jewish, there's less requirements of faith, right? Less uh, unverifiable truths that you have to accept.
Right. We're encouraged to question everything.
Yeah, but as I explained to somebody recently, if the Exodus didn't happen, if it didn't happen, it doesn't change my faith. It doesn't change my outlook as a Jew, right? For me, it doesn't change. It doesn't. I'm as strong in my faith and my practice if the Exodus happened or if it didn't happen. It doesn't change my belief. That's not the same in every religion, where at a certain point, if you don't have faith or you're not accepting these principles on faith, that you're essentially not part of that religion anymore. So that's the difference. And again, it's a challenge, right? But it's also, to me, an opportunity and something that I celebrate, because let's just say if something happens that we discover, right, and it challenges, preconceived notions, like, I mean, just this as an example, when the earth, when it was proven that the earth was rotating around the sun, that was a challenge to faith. I don't know that it wasn't really well, we weren't in power, so it's difficult to say, but it was not a challenge to Jewish faith when that was proven to be the case. When we discovered that that there's DNA at the root of our cellular structure and our physiology, it didn't challenge Judaism, really. If, let's say, one day aliens come from outer space and prove that we're not the only intelligent life in the universe, it doesn't really change Judaism. I mean, really, it doesn't. There's nothing in understanding that there could be life on, like, Judaism understands that it's possible that there's life on other planets. If you talk with Orthodox Jews and have a debate or discussion about it, they're like, yeah, maybe, who knows? But it doesn't change our faith. It could have tremendous impact on other religions. But so that's the good thing about it. But it does, for other people, it's difficult, because if people want to have, doctrines that they have to accept, it's not as easy, right? It's not as easy of a faith for people who crave direction and instruction for what to believe. It's a challenge.
I was raised thinking that I was taught that God gave the Torah in its entirety to Moses, to man, whatever expression you want to use. It wasn't until I started studying it as an adult that the more earthly creation of the Torah, the political aspects, the priests writing it, the multiple authors, all of those theories, that it actually made me much more comfortable in my belief, because a God created set of writings of things that hadn't happened and that hadn't happened yet, and all of that was a hindrance to me, was a block. But it made my Judaism stronger, my belief in Judaism and the power and the strength and the spirituality, if you will, to know that our texts were not God-given, not meaning they weren't God-inspired, but weren't God-written, which is the way I was taught, that very concrete version. So I found it empowering, if you will.
No, listen, I agree with you, Judith. And though I never believed that the Torah was written by God or dictated by God. I mean, I always kind of, as I read it, was like, how could,
Right.
but as I learned more about about how it might have been composed and learned more about it as an adult, and just read more, my faith grew. And it wasn't because I said, well, God definitely did these things. And again, I would assume that as a kid, I probably assumed maybe that the miracles happened as they were stated, because as a kid, I just maybe believed that, but I don't know. All I'm saying is it didn't lessen my faith or my practice or my connection by thinking about what might really have happened. I mean, the converse happened. I became more observant as I got older, but that's just my own story. But yeah, I 100% feel the same way. But yeah, I mean, these are all questions that we ask ourselves with the text. As going back to the prophets, I mean, Jonah, the prophets that we're reading now, like Micah, and then next week Nahum, and the prophets that we're reading, some of them are very short. There's similarities across all of them. Jonah really is the one that stands out as like the one that doesn't belong there, because it's a narrative for the most part. It doesn't really have a prophecy. It's just like different than everything else. It's almost like an April Fool's joke, where people, or it's like, I can't believe I'm making this comparison, but it's the Deadpool of the prophets, in that he breaks down the fourth wall, he talks to the audience, and it's almost like a parody of the motif, of the themes, and so that's what Jonah is. It's almost like a parody of like what prophets do, and it's to me, it's one of the most amazing books of the Bible, but it doesn't follow anything like these other prophets do. But every one of them has something that we that I've shown you. Even the short book of Joel that has lines in it that are very famous. We read the most famous line of Micah, or one of the most famous, two really, really famous ones we read last week. We read this one that we also find, of course, in the book of Isaiah, at the beginning of chapter 4, and I shared with you again that days to come from Jerusalem, right? Many nations will go and say, "Come, let us go to the Mount of God. For instruction shall come forth from Zion, Ki mitzion tetzei Torah, Devar Adonai miYerushalayim." And then, of course, it says, "And God will judge among many peoples, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares." And again, we talked about the fact that this text is almost the same in Isaiah and Micah. Who came first? Did they draw from a similar source? Was it, as some people said, God told both of them the same thing? But then again, this very famous line that George Washington riffed on, which is, everyone, right, every family shall sit under its own vine and fig tree, with none to disturb them, which is a beautiful vision of what Isaiah and Micah would say for us in Israel, but he said it for the people in America, and specifically to the Jewish people, so that they would know that this is what's happening. So then we read last week, where we finished up, was this very interesting, and Reverend Lynn is here somewhere. She was on. Reverend Lynn is there. We read this very famous line from Micah, which seems to be talking about Jesus, or at least Christians believed it was talking about Jesus, because it talked about this person from Bethlehem that was going to rule. And again, it seems as though this person is going to stand and shepherd by the might of God. What's interesting about it is that it seems to be happening very soon, that he was going to lead us should the Assyrians invade our land, which of course they did. Yeah, it doesn't seem like it's for hundreds and hundreds of years off, but as we mentioned, the rabbis did the same thing. They would talk about prophecies, or they take a line out of Torah, and didn't even have to be a prophecy, and they would say that it refers to something that happened in their day. And so this line became one of the lines that the church used to say that was Jesus. But again, this is everyone from the tribe of everyone from King David's family, from the root of David. All of those people came from Bethlehem. I mean, because that's where David came from. So everyone knew that David was from Bethlehem, that the dynasty started in Bethlehem. And again, the fact that that was not the center of power, right? It was not Jerusalem. It was not the richest part. It was more of the countryside. It's like saying the guy was from Kansas. And that was definitely important for them during their time. At that time, that King David and his family would be there. So we finished. Where did we finish, folks? I think we finished right after that.
Yeah.
I think this is right where we left off, right here. Rosemary, if you
That sounds right.
continue here, this is where we kind of again talking about where Micah sees us and the fact that I think we mentioned it last week that Micah, what's interesting about him is that he shoots past the Assyrians to talk about the Babylonians. And that's what makes him, again, in some ways, one of the more spectacular of the prophets, because unlike Isaiah, where we believe there's a second Isaiah who definitely talked about the Babylonians, Micah lives during the time of first Isaiah, from the Isaiah that is the Isaiah. He's roughly the same age, not as wealthy, not as connected as Isaiah. He's out in the suburbs or the exurbs of Jerusalem in Moresha, but he writes at the same time, but he actually seems to get it that the Babylonians are coming up behind the Assyrians. So he was like at that level, one of the most kind of as a prognosticator, he's pretty good because what he saw was good, did happen, and that's a pretty good one. Pretty good one. All right, so let's read.
The remnant of Jacob shall be in the midst of the many peoples, like dew from God, like droplets on grass, which do not look to anybody, nor place their hope in mortals. The remnant of Jacob shall be among the nations in the midst of the many peoples, like a lion among beasts of the wild, like a fierce lion among flocks of sheep, which tramples wherever it goes and rends with none to deliver.
And again, you can see both of those sections begin with that phrase, Sharit Yaakov, right? The remnant of Jacob. So sometimes we have the remnant of Israel, Sharit Yisrael, but the remnant of Jacob.
Your hand shall prevail over your foes, and all your enemies shall be cut down. In that day, declares God, I will destroy the horses in your midst and wreck your chariots. I will destroy the cities of your land and demolish all your fortresses. I will destroy the sorcery you practice, and you shall have no more soothsayers. I will destroy your idols and the sacred pillars in your midst, and no more shall you bow down to the work of your hands. I will tear down the sacred posts in your midst and destroy your cities. In anger and wrath will I wreak retribution on the nations that have not obeyed.
Yeah, let me just see this note here. Well, it's probably the nations, but what's interesting about this section, and I think it kind of, it goes into the next chapter too, that there's going to be a wholesale destruction of Jerusalem and much of the country. And that's because there needs to be a fresh start. So what's interesting about what Micah's saying is that as much as Israel is going to survive, as much as Israel is going to come back, to some extent, he's mixing different things here, which is the exile, the fact that they're going to survive exile, they're going to be strong even in the exile. The homeland is going to go through a tremendous destruction. And that's partly to destroy the country of Assyria that's there, but that's occupying, if you will, but it's also to destroy Israel because they have so much idolatry and so much bad stuff that's going on there that the whole place is going to get destroyed. But it has to, because you've built these idols and these sacred shrines and all these things, and they're all going to get wiped out. So when the Assyrians get wiped out, they're going to get wiped out too. So everything is going to essentially have to start over. But the good thing about it is you're going to get rid of all these problems that you have, especially again with these idolatries, these sacred posts, these asherot, that you have, which is probably what the note here says, is that it's Asherah, these the goddess of Asherah, fertility goddess. So yeah, I'm gonna tear all this stuff down, right? So you're not going to do that anymore. Okay. Here we go.
Hear what God is saying. Come, present my case before the mountains, and let the hills hear you pleading. Hear, you mountains, God's case, you firm foundations of the earth. For God has a case against this covenanted people, a suit against Israel. My people, what wrong have I done you? What hardship have I caused you? Testify against me. In fact, I brought you up from that land of Egypt. I redeemed you from the house of bondage, and I sent before you Moses, Aaron, and Miriam.
So here's a reference within the Bible, and whenever we get to them, we got to point them out. Here's a reference in the Bible to other parts of the Bible, right? So this is the Exodus we were just talking about. So 400 years later, roughly, we're still talking about it, right? It's still a part of who we are. And it's part of who we are 2,800 years ago. So if the story was invented, and if the story was completely, again, an imagination or whatever, it was part of our imagination 2,800 years ago. Okay? So it was critical by the time of the prophets that 100% this story was a part of who we are. Again, remember, there are people who say that the Bible wasn't written yet, okay? I mean, even the people who believe that the Bible was written early are still telling you that maybe not all of the Bible, not all of the Tanakh, or the first 5 books of the Torah were written at this point, okay? Fine, we get it. But this understanding of what happened, right? Yetziat Mitzrayim, leaving Egypt, leaving the house of bondage, is there. And of course, what you also notice is, as Judith was pointing out, sometimes we have a problem that we don't think about the women of our history, but Micah clearly includes Miriam. So Moses, Aaron, and Miriam are all alluded to here as being part of the leadership, the prophetic, and again, the religious political leaders of our people when we left Egypt. Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. All 3 of them. So that's a wonderful acknowledgement that Miriam was included with this, this triumvirate back then. So that's good to know, right? It's good to know Miriam was part of the package. All right.
My people, remember what Balak, king of Moab, plotted against you, and how Balaam, son of Beor, responded to him. Recall your passage from Shittim to Gilgal, and you will recognize God's gracious acts.
Now, here's another reference to a Torah story, right? This is from, well, that part's from the crossing during the time of Joshua. But this part here, this first part is from Numbers, right? The story of Balak and Balaam. Now, this is very clear. I mean, this is a synopsis. It's consistent with what the book of Numbers said happened, which is that Balak, the king of Moab, hired Balaam, this foreign prophet, to curse Israel. And of course, that's where we get the famous Matovu, right? The prayer, how goodly are your tents, how beautiful are your tents, Jacob, right? So this is a reference to really 2 more parts of the Bible, Numbers and the book of Joshua. And again, Micah is referring to these things during his prophet, as part of his prophecies, during this little riff he's on right now. This is basically telling our history. He's summarizing our history after leaving Egypt. of the things that God has done for us. So, yeah, I mean, again, when the Bible references other parts of the Bible, it's important. It's worth, again, thinking about, just recognizing that they do it. I mean, and it seems pretty consistent with what we have. So it's not proof that these stories were written. I don't know how to describe it, but it's not that this is proof, at least, that by the 8th century, that there was these stories already were part of who we are. That's, at the very least, that's what this is. Okay.
With what shall I approach God? Do homage to God on high. Shall I approach with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Would God be pleased with thousands of rams, with myriads of streams of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for my sins?
Now, these couple of lines, right? Well, so I just want, because I'm controlling text right now. You can have a Bible open in front of you, but so look at the setup of this. What do I come to God with? What do I stand before God with? Sacrifices, right? Really good sacrifices. A calf, right? A cow, 1-year-old cow. You know, this is like high levels of effort. Rams, thousands of rams, streams of oil, right? And then he says, well, shall I give my firstborn, right? Which is what other people did, right? Other people thought that this is what you had to do in order to get God's favor, right? What does God want from us? And that's what he's saying. What does God want from us? What does God need from us? What's the level of commitment that we have to show to God? And here's, if not the most famous part, because the other part said is also in Isaiah, this part's only here in Micah. And people, well, let's take a look at it.
You have been told, O mortal, what is good and what God requires of you, only to do justice and to love goodness and to walk modestly with your God.
Yep. So that phrase right there is used all over the place, especially, by the way, interestingly, by people in the church. Osei mishpat, or asot mishpat, ohavat chesed, achav chesed, right? And hatznei alechet im Elohecha. This phrase, or these threefold phrase, you'll see this on signs, you'll see this on bumper stickers, you'll see this, you know, thousands and thousands of years later, people put this on t-shirts. And it's from our prophet Micah. And it's such a beautiful phrase because it has that phrase that we have in a lot of the prophets, right? Right? Mishpat, right? Mishpat is law. But also here, rather than tzedek, which is righteousness, we have chesed, which is loving kindness or goodness. And so to do justice, to love goodness, and to walk modestly with God. I mean, think about what it's laying out here, right? Both our external relationship with God and with others, but also to some extent, you know, how we live our lives, right? How do we go about our days? You know, what's the model of, you know, how we go about every day, which is this idea of walking modestly, right? To have this kind of humility, which is why I said at the beginning, that's going to be something we're going to come back to, you know, this humility or modesty, to understand that, like, we don't know everything. And also, I don't need to call attention to myself. I don't need people watching me, right? to feel good about myself, which of course is the exact opposite of what our culture is teaching people, right? The whole concept of TikTok and Instagram and Snapchat and everything else is to brag and to put yourself out there and to, quite frankly, be immodest. And it's tough because we have a generation of young people now that have spent a good chunk of their lives learning the exact opposite of this, at least the last part. And it's tough to do the other parts when that's what you're thinking about. So, I mean, just the very
Be trying
nature.
to get likes from God.
Yes. Well, definitely not living in, definitely not living in a bathing suit in front of a camera. It's doing irreparable damage to our society. And it's tough. It's tough to see. It's tough to know that that's what's going on, right? So the reason that it's translated as modesty and not humility is the word tsneah. It's the word that we use in Hebrew and Yiddish too for modesty. Is sneas, right? Judith, what's sneas? They teach you that do they teach that at Hebrew school?
In Hebrew school, it's new. It's modesty. It's modesty
Yeah, but it's also particularly for young women,
for young women, right?
not
Elbows and shoulders and knees and
not letting people see your body. And of course, later on for married women, it's covering your hair. Yeah, sneas is a whole realm of life especially for women. And so the concept, for modesty, we talk a lot about it, how different our world is from the Orthodox extreme, Haredi life where women are covered. But again, for everybody, there's this idea that there is there's a modest way of dressing, because men are not supposed to wear flashy clothes. They're also supposed to be wearing plain clothes. But this concept for us a lot comes oftentimes to the dress and to the styles and to the, to being humble, but modest in our not just humble, but humble in attire, and not bringing attention to yourself, right? So this idea of again, I also, some of us sometimes get a little holier than thou, and we think we're living a better life than somebody else, or we're, look, this is I'm just gonna say this right now because it's funny, and I think about it occasionally. I don't think about it a lot, but one of the most obnoxious things about I don't even go around, like, unless somebody asks me. I don't go around telling people I'm a vegetarian because it's one of the most obnoxious things that people, when people call them a vegetarian, or then somebody tells you, somebody tells you that they're vegan, like, you're vegetarian, but I'm vegan, and
You're
yeah,
more vegetarian than that.
yeah. Anyways, there's a great scene in the movie Scott Pilgrim versus the World, which it's a great movie actually, but there's a scene where, this guy says he's a 7th level vegetarian and, vegan, and it turns out he ate meat once and he loses his powers. But it's a great social commentary on the obnoxiousness of, and I'm fully willing to acknowledge that and to admit it. It's one of the things I don't like about it is that, you start to, there's an assumption that everyone else eating meat there now has to feel guilty for, so I try not to convey that to people. But yeah, there is a almost an implicit obnoxiousness to, to vegetarianism. But anyways, but yeah, I mean, it's easy for people to do, and you know, what are you going to do? But there are people, especially in, I think, more observant communities, and it exists in every religious group, which is why people have it on T-shirts and why people in churches, put it up on a wall. Because look, I mean, other people, you don't have to. It's not just practice; it's the way you brag about, your faith or how many times you go to Bible study or whatever it is. That again, that's not what God's looking for. God's not looking for people to put on a show. And look, and what Micah does is he says, look, everyone who's excited about the sacrifices in the first place, they're all missing the point. And he's talking about at a time when they were doing the sacrifices. And he's saying, God doesn't care about those things. God wants you to do these things. And so they don't require money. On the contrary, money gets in the way of these things. And he's telling people, when you concentrate on these things, when you concentrate on this trifecta, you're gonna be doing what God wants, what's good, right? What is God hoping that you'll do? What is God like looking for? That's what the Doresh, the Hebrew Doresh Mimcha, what is he looking at? How is he evaluating you, right? That's almost, it could be a translation too. What is God inquiring of you or examining you for? And that's really important, that's what matters to us. And again, that's why this is one of the most powerful lines in Micah, and for that matter, in the whole books of the prophets, all of them, Isaiah, Jeremiah, whatever. This trifold saying, so famous and so wonderful, because it like transcends any type of religious understanding of what the practice is. If you're not hitting these things, you're not hitting it. So again, people love also, and as we've been reading in Pirkei Avot, they love a couple of lines like, if I'm not for myself, who is for me? They love those kind of lines, and we have a lot of them in Pirkei Avot. So this is very similar to that. This kind of like sets the stage for it. And of course, before Pirkei Avot, there's the book of Proverbs that we're going to read, which are also these types of lines of wisdom. But this is actually, again, even higher than that. This is like, what is God looking for? What is it that that we're being held accountable for? Any questions, comments, any thoughts, any points that people want to make on this line?
It's a reading from my burial office, which I've written out.
Whoa. Wow.
And you don't know, but I'm going to ask you to read it in Hebrew.
Well, I just did. Can we not talk about this for a very long time? No, it's well now, but the important thing is, Reverend Lynn, is you were with us to read it and to really think about these words as we point them out, like the word Doresh. By the way, I do want to point out that he says, you've been told, O mortal, what is good. We actually haven't been told this, just so you know. I mean, like, maybe we've been told it, it was implied by what we've been reading and by Jewish tradition, or Micah is saying, like, you know what we're supposed to know, but we haven't actually been told this. Nobody has said, when he says, you've been told, O mortal, what is good, it's a little bit like, what to do, right? But we literally have not been told this. I just want to say.
My translation is different.
What does it say?
It says, he has showed you. You've been showed or shown.
I'm not sure. So the word higid in Hebrew means to tell. It's the root for the word Haggadah, which we're going to read at Passover, right? It's the telling. It's when you tell the story to somebody. But yeah, I mean, it's more than just speaking. It's like a teaching. It's definitely a lot of, there's definitely a lot there when you're gonna higid to somebody, when you're gonna be told. It's not just I said to him, like Omer, the word Omer or Diber is like I said. So it's not that word. It's not like that, but it is almost like I've told you the story, like, from what you know, but you'd almost say because you know that story. But so he definitely has this understanding that, like, there's information out there and you should have, but it's not you've seen. It's not the root roeh, which means you've seen what to do, or shomea, you've heard what to do, which also could have been there, I guess, to some extent. But you have been told, by the way, implies that somebody else told it to you. Not that you just heard it, not that like somebody said it and you heard it, but somebody sat there and told it to you. So there is this understanding too that, like, it's actually been imparted to you. So,
Rabbi, can you be a bit more specific with that? Because, I have the luxury, as I'm sure we all do now that we're remote, to go between multiple monitors, and so I'm checking all kinds of text and
Yep.
and reading some things, and it's actually good for me because the second reading is always provides more clarity, and you say, we haven't been told, but I go all the way back to Genesis 6, where God was telling Noah, humans are just horrible. They're just evil. So we have been told. We've been told at the beginning of the book.
Well, there's definitely been ways of understanding this, right? As I said, it's implied, but nobody's actually said those words. This threefold formulation of justice, goodness, and walking modestly.
Oh, okay.
So I'm saying nobody's actually.
Okay.
I mean,
but you're never going to see the evidence for it either.
The problem is we've also been told you got to make sacrifices, right? The whole book of Leviticus is you got to make sacrifices. God wants you to offer up a cow and offer a goat and do this with a bird. And so God's told us lots of stuff, but it's almost as, again, and this is why people love Micah and Proverbs and Pirkei Avot, is that he's distilled it down to, like, what's this really about, right? And that's what people, that's when the guy comes to Hillel and says, teach me the whole Torah, right? On when I'm on one foot, and he says, what is hateful to you, don't do to others, right? The golden rule version that he teaches. But, and of course he says, the rest is commentary, go learn it. So he does tell the guy to go learn it, but he gives him the formulation of what we're supposed to do. And this one's a threefold, but what's so great about this is that it covers ethical behavior. Like, how do you run society with mishpat, with justice, right? Goodness, right? Goodness. I mean, it's loving kindness. Chesed has got so much more than just goodness, right? But ahavat chesed is like when we say to somebody, you got to love, it's loving chesed, it's loving people, right? That's what's so great about it, is the word chesed also implies loving kindness, right? That's the way, I don't know how your Bibles on the different screens are translating chesed, but you almost can't translate it because we don't have another word for love. But ahava and chesed both have the understanding of love, but loving people, loving kindness. So it's ahavat chesed is like, you can love your people, you can love, there's ahavat, there's ahavat Israel, loving Israel, loving your family, whatever. This is loving, the act of loving people. So it's a really, really powerful. There's almost no loving goodness is a weak translation, but it's like that's the only one you usually see. I'm like, you're going to see almost every one of them say loving goodness or loving kindness. Actually, a lot of them will say loving kindness. But
one of the readings always at the Great Vigil of Easter is the crossing of the Red Sea. And I always cringe at that. It's so harsh. It's so mean and unloving.
But it's because of the redemption, right? And it's the reason that they show, 10 Commandments every year at Easter, right? Because of that. but look, I mean, that's going to be, the Signal asked me to write an article for Passover. And what I'm going to talk about is what we talked about a couple times in the last few weeks, including when we read the book of Jonah, which is that, the Bible teaches us that in the story of Exodus, when we cross the Red Sea and the Egyptians die, remember the famous story is that, we're singing Micha Mocha, we're singing that we're free, and the angels start singing our song, and God tells them to stop. God tells them to be quiet because my people are drowning. The Egyptians, the people that I created, are drowning. So
Right.
what are you celebrating? You're in my team, and my team is everybody, right? So yeah, I get it that Israel is celebrating right now, but my creations are dying. And so it's an interesting midrash because when the rabbis wrote that, and they wrote it during the time of the Romans, it's not like they were writing it at a time when they were super powerful or happy with their power. They understood that when our enemies die is not a time to celebrate. This is not what we're celebrating. We might have been celebrating freedom, and we're definitely celebrating the fact that we don't have to be slaves. But at the same time, you cannot celebrate the death of even your enemies. And that's what Jonah is taught, at the end of the day, that, look, the Ninevites are people. And when God says, how can I let them be destroyed? It's another reminder for us that we're not taking joy in other people dying. If people are happy at death tolls, they need help. They need help.
You remember when Osama bin Laden was killed?
Yep.
And there was cheering, and
Yep.
we were told stop,
Yep.
don't cheer.
And that was America behaving, to me, along the lines of biblical principles, which are
Absolutely.
this is not the way we behave, and
This is not us.
This is not the culture that we have. And again, it's the message of Micah of loving goodness, loving kindness. If you're loving humanity, and again, it says mortal, right? It says Adam. This is not just assumingly Jews, it's mortals, it's Adam, it's everybody. And walking modestly is definitely not walking with a sense of, look at what I can do to you because of my strength. This is a reminder for people who would otherwise. And again, I mean, like, he's talking to people who he's reminding them, there's going to be some tough times ahead, but it's not always been the case. I mean, we've already seen Micah, and we mentioned this last week. He's specifically talking about prophets that are being paid to give people what they want to hear, which is everything's good, everything's great. You're strong, you're powerful. You're gonna beat the Assyrians. You're God's chosen people. And so this is what Micah is upset about, because he takes to task immediately. We talked about it in chapter 2. He takes to task the prophets that were doing the exact opposite of this. So it takes a lot of courage for him to say these kinds of things, because again, he's not a prophet. He's not a guy who's doing what the other prophets were doing at the time. He says that. I mean, he points it out. So again, this is not the whole text. Kind of ends there for us, but as you can see, it's a semicolon, but this is not even the end of the whole text. But it's a good enough end that some people will put a period on that one. But this translation definitely doesn't, because when you start with then, which I don't know that it has to start with then, but let's read what it says.
Then will your name achieve wisdom. Hark, God summons the city. Hear, O scepter, for who can direct her but you? Will I overlook in houses of the wicked the granaries of wickedness and the accursed short ephah?
So again, looking at this, we've read about this before, actually in one of our previous readings of Amos.
What do they call that when they shrink what's in the package?
Yes. Yes, it's over. Yeah, there's a word for it, right?
Right.
You're just talking about it. Actually, Biden was talking about it the other day about potato chips that come in packages that are they're,
Right.
they're
It's
taking away
not
our,
8 ounces, it's 7.5.
they're taking away our potato chips.
Right.
Yeah, that's the accursed short APA, right? This is people who are again shorting people and taking advantage of them by their measurements. So yeah, I'm not going to overlook that, right? I'm not, God's saying, here it is.
Shall they be acquitted despite wicked balances and a bag of fraudulent weights? Whose wealthy are full of lawlessness, and whose inhabitants speak treachery with tongues of deceit in their mouths.
Yep.
I, in turn, have beaten you sore, have stunned you for your sins. You have been eating without getting your fill, and there is a gnawing at your vitals. You have been conceiving without bearing young, and what you bore I would deliver to the sword.
Yeah, that's pretty harsh, right?
That's harsh.
Yeah.
This is a horrible image, right? Which is
You're going to miscarry, and if you do give birth, they're going to die in the war.
yeah, this is really harsh. I mean, again, this is 5 verses, 6 verses after these beautiful lines about walking humbly and loving, right? Is like this is what you're looking for. So he changes quick. As I said, there's only 7 chapters here, but it's almost like he's like condensed Isaiah and the things that we've read in Jeremiah and Ezekiel for that matter. He's condensed like 40 chapters into 7 chapters, and he's like it's still all there, but it's like compressed. It's like a compressed book because all of a sudden he's just like he's changed gears and now he's doing this horrible, this is what you're looking at. These are your warning.
You have been sowing, but have nothing to reap. You have trod olives, but have no oil for rubbing, and grapes, but have no wine to drink. Yet you have kept the laws of Omri and all the practices of the house of Ahab, and have followed what they devised. Therefore, I will make you an object of horror, and the city's inhabitants an object of hissing, and you shall bear the mockery of peoples.
Yeah. And so
Wow.
here, Omri and Ahab, right? They are Omri was the dynasty, was Ahab's grandfather, was the house of Omri. And Ahab was the most famous of those kings. And so this is synonymous with Israel, right? Behaving like those people in the north. This is, let's see the note here. Yeah. Again, similar phrases that were used in Jeremiah. Yeah, you're going to be a mockery. You're going to be an example for other people of what happens when people go away from God. And again, very similar language to this, what we've seen in some cases, almost the exact same language as we've seen in some of the other prophets. Now, again, Jeremiah lives much after, 150 years after this. So did he know about, this kind of phrase that was used? Or again, probably an idiom of the time that people hissed at, at places that had been destroyed, or, they that was a way of cursing those places. So that's the way this chapter ends. Now there's one more chapter. Now, again, it goes back and forth. It goes back and forth and back and forth. But let's see how chapter 7 in the final chapter, let's see how this ends, if it does end.
Woe is me. I am become like leavings of a fig harvest, like gleanings when the vintage is over. There is not a cluster to eat, nor a ripe fig I could desire.
That's a pretty visual image, right? Comparing himself to a field that's been gone over. There's nothing left. I'm gone. I'm empty.
The pious are vanished from the land. None upright are left among its people. All lie in wait to commit crimes. Every last one traps the other in a net. They are eager to do evil. The magistrate makes demands, and the judge judges for a fee. The rich one makes a crooked plea, and they grant it.
This is the corruption that he's been talking about.
The best of them is like a prickly shrub, the most upright, worse than a barrier of thorns. On the day you waited for, your doom has come. Now their confusion shall come to pass. Trust no friend, rely on no intimate, be guarded in speech with her who lies in your bosom. For son spurns father, daughter rises up against mother, daughter-in-law against mother-in-law. A man's own household are his enemies.
Yeah. This is not great imagery, and it's something we also have at the end of the prophet Malachi, which is about, again, parents and children turning back to each other, right? But the idea that there's this intergenerational fighting is something that is really, really sad, right? You have it also in Christian Bible, where Jesus tells his disciples that that's the way things are going to be. You know, we're going to have families turning on families. That's just the way it's going to be because of this new, this new order that's coming into place. It's going to cause families to turn on each other. This is what's happening here. I will say that daughter-in-law against mother-in-law, that seems pretty normal, actually, but not always. Not always.
Well, some of us have
No,
relations with our daughters-in-law.
I know. My mother had a relationship with Tracy. It's never always like that. Like, I don't want to say it, but that one seems a little too common. Daughter-in-law against mother. Really?
Well, they're kind of reminding you that, hey, it doesn't have to be like that.
Doesn't have to, it's right. Shouldn't be like that, but I'd be like, really, Mike?
I mean, sons spurn their fathers a lot too.
I know. That is like that, but yeah, you're right.
And daughters against mothers, that happens.
Well, that I know, but those are the ones that are like, can't we fix that? Like, you should know better. But like the daughter-in-law, mother-in-law, it's almost like that relationship is almost set up.
It's like a joke.
Exactly. It's actually set up. The setup on there is really not good.
Right.
It's just almost impossible. So I mean, you hope that they do, but it's tough. Yes, it's almost like interesting. It didn't say father-in-law against. Did say father-in-law against son-in-law. I don't know why. I mean, you can say that's also, but interestingly though, I don't know if that's one of the relationships that not that people don't have a really good relationship with their father-in-laws, but it's almost like a relationship like who talks about I don't mean that's like it has to be that way, but a lot of times father-in-laws and son-in-laws really don't have a relationship, but it doesn't have to be that way. But it's almost like it's not like it's bad or good. It's just
that's men for you.
Exactly. It's just men going, well, whatever. I mean, that's his thing,
Yeah, right.
and just stay out of his way. But I wonder if that's why it wasn't there. It's just like guys just they're not looking for a relationship. But again, it's wonderful if the son-in-law and it's wonderful.
Your foot is in it now. You can't get out.
No, I can only tell you it's wonderful. Hypothetically, it's wonderful if it happens. If it happens to you. I'm not asking for anyone's stories right now. I'm just saying it's interesting that it's not there. It's interesting that it's not there. And it's interesting that that in my experience, it's just like something that people usually they don't talk that much about it. Not that it's necessarily bad, but yes, the mother-in-law, daughter-in-law thing, I think it's got to be biblical. It's got to go back to biblical times. Anyways, but it's good. It should be good. All right. So here's the first 6 verses of that chapter, but then look what happens here.
Yet I will look to God. I will wait for the God who saves me. My God will hear me. Do not rejoice over me, O my enemy. Though I have fallen, I rise again. Though I sit in darkness, God is my light.
So this is where, at least for Micah, he's saying, I'm not going to despair, right? So whatever happens around me, I'm going to wait, right? I'm going to have patience, and I know that God will hear me, right? Yishmani an Elohai, my God is gonna hear me, right? God will hear me. So yeah, and again, don't, enemy, people who don't like me or people who are against me, you don't celebrate, because I'm gonna be just fine. I'm gonna be fine. So that is, again, a beautiful image, that I'm sitting in darkness, but God is my light. I do have a light, or Lee, right? God is my light. Here we go.
I must bear God's anger against whom I have sinned until my cause is championed and my claim upheld. I will be brought out into the light. I will enjoy divine vindication. When my enemy sees it, she shall be covered with shame. She who taunts me with, where is this God of yours, the eternal one? My eyes shall behold her downfall. Lo, she shall be for trampling like mud in the streets.
Now, does anyone see
It's
something?
interesting that we shift to women
Exactly.
because it's almost all male.
Yes. So this is very, very, very strange, right? So when we see, let me just see if there's any of the commentary here that I'll share with you. Nope. Let's just see if there's any of the commentaries. Let's see, that are in English. Nope. None of them are here. Nope. None of these ones talk about it. That I can show you. But again, very rare that the people taunting or the people in power, right, are women, because here it's clearly the person who is making fun of Micah, who's assessing his situation, the one who, again, he talks before about his enemies rejoicing. Here it is in terms of a woman. So is it comparing the Assyrians or the Babylonians eventually to a woman? It's possible.
Doesn't it sound like Jezebel? Or am I way off time?
No, you're not way off.
That
I mean,
era, yeah.
it's after Jezebel, and we had a reference to Ahab, and but I mean, it wouldn't be necessarily Jezebel herself, but this is a look, it appears that this is somebody who's not an Israelite. This appears that it's not a Jew, because even though he definitely takes the Jews to task, the idea of where is this God of yours seems to be, again, the eternal one, Adonai. It seems as though this is somebody who doesn't have belief in that God. Not that, it's like that person doesn't seem to have that faith. This doesn't share the same faith. Not that they're thinking that they're doing the right thing, but that they don't even believe in this God. But yes, Jezebel comes to mind because she literally was trampled to death. Her body was trampled to death, and she literally ended like this. So, could that be part of his imagery? Maybe, because Jezebel was not an Israelite. She was a Phoenician. She was from Lebanon and from the northern Canaanite peoples. But yeah, it seems as though this is somebody who isn't down with our God, to put it in today's terms. Somebody who is going to pay the price for their lack of faith, and for their for humiliating me, you're going to be humiliated. And that's the those are the phrases that are used here. Busha, which is humiliation or embarrassment. Yeah, but I don't know if somebody has another translation or something else that they're holding that has some other a commentary or other insight on this. But again, it is unusual that it's from the point of view as of the woman who's humiliating us and then who will be humiliated.
A day for mending your walls? That is a far off day. This is rather a day when to you tramplers will come streaming from Assyria and the towns of Egypt, from every land, from Egypt to the Euphrates, from sea to sea, and from mountain to mountain. And your land shall become a desolation because of those who dwell in it as the fruit of their misdeeds. Oh, shepherd your people with your staff, your very own flock. May they who dwell isolated in a woodland surrounded by farmland graze Bashan and Gilead as in olden days.
So it definitely seems to be he seems to be addressing God here. Oh, shepherd your people. Oh, shepherd your people with your staff. Shepherd your people, capital Y, your staff. God's going to do this. And again, it seems to be people who've already been exiled. So let them come back to Bashan and Gilad, which are in the Golan. Let those people come back to those areas and let them have their homes back. Let them come back from those areas who are isolated, who are cut off. Let them be back in our homeland. So again, he's talking about bad stuff happening now, right? Like this is where we're at right now. Again, that isn't what was happening, but it's going to be what's happening. And he's saying it's unavoidable, that it's going to happen. He's also saying don't give up faith, but he's saying it's going to happen. Again, as he has said earlier, we saw it last week in chapter 2, other prophets are not telling people this, though. They're telling people everything is okay. And he is saying, no, it's not okay. And that's why we kept him.
I will show him wondrous deeds, as in the days when you sallied forth from the land of Egypt. Let nations behold and be ashamed, despite all their might. Let them put hand to mouth. Let their ears be deafened.
So you can see, as in the days when you sallied forth from the land of Egypt, right? In the days that you say, Mitzrayim, the days that you came forward out of Egypt. So again, let me just see if the note here is, show us. Show us the wondrous deeds. Yeah.
Let them list dust like snakes, like crawling things on the ground. Let them come trembling out of their strongholds. To the eternal our God, let them fear and dread you. Who is a God like you, forgiving iniquity and remitting transgression, not staying angry forever toward the remnant of your own people, because you love graciousness.
And again, this is a play off of the famous phrase, no se'avon v'fesha v'chesed le'emet, the same thing that we say when we open up the ark at Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, that God is forgiving iniquity, remitting transgression, not staying angry forever. So this is using that same phrase that we saw when God, appears to Moses at Mount Sinai, with that phrase that Moses says and that we quote, and the other, it's quoted elsewhere in the prophets. It's quoted, we just read it in Jonah, but this is part of the description of God, that God is forgiving iniquity. It's interesting, again, for us, God's forgiveness is like the paramount characteristic of the way that we encounter God, right? So we talk about God's creation, God's redemption, God saving us the Red Sea, God's power. But what we really do focus on, especially with the prophets, and to some extent, like when you add up the totality of the Hebrew Bible, it's this: God's forgiveness, God's allowing us to be forgiven, right? And so this is, we talk about it a lot, and people talk about it a lot in Christianity, that, God is a God of forgiveness, but that's because it comes out of, as you can see, the Bible. And again, to some extent, the whole book of Leviticus is about offering up sacrifices to get that. And again, already by the time of the prophets, and already while the temple is still very much standing, it's going to be destroyed, but it's going to be rebuilt, and it's going to be in operation for another 500 years. You already have people saying, okay, but it's not about the sacrifices. It's about doing good things. It's about it's about trying to get it right before you screw up. And then if you screw up, that God is going to forgive us. Right? It doesn't here because you gave a good sacrifice. Did you do it because God loves? Because God, chafetz hesed, because God loves great chesed. I don't know why they translate it as graciousness, but God loves. God is searching, and God is wanting, and God is drawn to chesed, right? So that's the word chesed there, which, again, not sure why they translated it here as graciousness, but fine, whatever. It's not the end of the world. Yeah.
Rather,
Yeah.
you just said something that just doesn't click with me. That you said God is, and not just Judaism but Christianity, is God's forgiving. But one of the first things he did after he created man was wipe them off the face of the earth. And we keep reading throughout the Torah of all the craziness and mayhem that he brings on the species he created on the planet. So where how does that jive?
Because God is like a parent, right? That God gets angry at us and punishes us, and then we hope that's it. That
So tough love? Is that what you're saying? Tough love?
Yeah, and that God, after God punishes us, then we're forgiven. And so, look, that we know that up until the temple, again, we stop having the temple. Like we talk about this before. Why does Judaism not talk in the Torah? Talk about all the time. Why do we not have these discussions in the Torah and the Bible as a whole on heaven and hell? Because the punishment and the whole system of forgiveness and love and redemption and fixing and like coming back was as a collective group. It wasn't as an individual. So God's not, we didn't value our forgiveness necessarily just based on ourselves. It was based on the collective. One second. I turn it's about collective punishment, and it's collective responsibility. It's not about one individual, going to heaven. It's about whether we get to stay in our land, whether we get forgiven and get to come home, as a people. So that's why it's always about, our people, towards the remnant of our people. However many are left after the punishment, that's how we're going to be forgiven. That's how we're going to be. So it's not that the forgiveness is on an individual to like be saved, if you will, or to go to heaven, but it's as the collective going through the punishment as a group, and then us, meriting to be forgiven. So
when
and that's
at least
still,
in the
what? Sorry?
At least in the Episcopal Church, outside of worship, when we have confession, either privately or with a priest. It's individual. However, in worship, it's collective. The confession is collective, which I always find very interesting.
Yeah, and that's what we do. Obviously, we talk about all the time at Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. All of our prayers for forgiveness are as a collective. We have sinned, Hashamnu Bagadna, we have sinned, we have transgressed. And so, yeah, the litany of exactly as Reverend Lynn said, the collective prayer, it's collective punishment and collective forgiveness, understanding that as a group. But that's what we have here, right? Because he says right here, your people, right? It's not me, it's about the group. So that's why, again, the focus is almost always on, when we're talking about these kinds of things in the Bible, at least, again, we talked about it, on Wednesday nights in the Talmud and in the, in the other texts. Then it starts after the destruction of the temple, then it becomes much more a personalized, individual, familial issue. And then, but there's always that collective, because even in exile, it was like, what we're a people. And then, of course, when we have a land again, now it becomes a collective. It becomes a collective punishment, and there's this understanding of it. But that's like, that's the last 100 years. That's the Holocaust, and that's Israel, and that's everything else. Where we once again now speak as the collective in ways that like we almost didn't for the previous 2,000 years. We're almost going back to the collective, because like we can see ourselves as a community again. I don't know that Jews in Iraq and Jews in Ukraine and Jews, I know they knew that they were these different Jewish communities, but I think they were so disconnected by distance that even though that they knew that those communities and they cared about them, I'm not saying they didn't care about them, but the understanding of it was so much less. It was so much more localized, because that's just the reality of what people how they lived. But now we're not like that again, and for better or worse, that's that's the way we look at stuff now, is the collective, kind of going back to the biblical visions of this. So again, we're hoping that God is going to God's gonna do this. And now look at this line right here.
God will take us back in love, quashing our iniquities. You will hurl all our sins into the depths of the sea.
So this line's pretty famous for us as Jews. And I would say it's definitely become more famous for us in the last 25, 30 years. As we read this line, we say this line, these last four words, or we say the whole line, but it starts from here. When do we say this?
At Tashlik.
Yeah, that's where the word tashlich comes from. Hurl our sins into the depths of the sea. Which seems to be a lot deeper than the pond at Bridgeport.
Yeah, why can't we make a pilgrimage out to the beach, for gosh sakes?
We could, but any waters that have animals in them are good for this. But again, it's not like we literally believed that, that what we're doing. It's a symbol, right? It's a symbolic act. And again, tossing your sins into, a cup of water wouldn't really have the same power. But I guess the closer you can get to the symbolism, but you definitely can. There's no reasons. Synagogues that are closer to the ocean generally will do tashlich by the water. So if they're Santa Monica or Ventura, they will go to the water there, as it's pretty close. But
Obviously, a boat.
Yes, if you really want to get serious, you gotta go out.
Tashlich cruising. It's a new thing.
That's right. It's a whole new company.
Yeah, it's weird too, because there's a lot of people that just commit more sins out at sea, actually, but especially with regards to eating and drinking, but without any constraints or whatever, or restraints. Yeah. Into the depths of the sea. But yeah, the fact that God will take us back in love is a beautiful idea. And again, in the Hebrew, Yerachamenu is rachem, right? Mercy. I don't know. I don't love the translation of love there, but the word rachem has as its root the womb, right? The womb. It's the the word rachama or rach, the rachamim, the concept of God of mercy is this love that again is almost like a womb-like protection and mercy of again what we expand that God will do for us. And yeah, the concept of again, I don't know, quashing, what does it say here? Forgiving, yeah. Kabashu. Put the kibosh. Yichabesh. It's, I don't know if it's the same. I don't think it's from the same. Could be. Kibosh. Look it up, maybe. Maybe kibosh comes from that same thing, but it is in Hebrew this idea that it's getting rid of the sins in the first place, or the iniquities, the avonotenu, which is another word for here it's chatotam, which is the chet, but we use those phrases a lot in the high holidays. So God will do that, hurl our sins, make them so that we don't even have them that much too in the first place, but taking us back in love. And again, the word yashuv is the root for teshuva, for return, coming home, coming back. And here is the way it ends.
You will keep faith with Jacob, loyalty to Abraham, as you promised on oath to our fathers in days gone by.
Yeah. And so Micah, is notably, like, he finishes obviously on a positive note, right? The last few verses are ones of, well, these are, we're going to pay back our enemies, and you're going to take us back in love. But it's not a lot of verses, and it's not like some of the other prophets would go on and on about this for many verses of prophecy or text, right? Not Micah. Micah kind of gets to the point. He jumps around a lot, and he moves between ideas that we've seen in other prophets. He does them much quicker. And he does them almost like in a shorthand that when we see him, we're like, oh yeah, we've seen that element before. It's just like it's one line. And again, what he finishes with is this line that we have in the prophets, and we have it in a lot in our prayers, right? Which is that God is going to do for us what God promised us back before, right? So with our ancestors, with Abraham, they mentioned specifically Abraham and Jacob, Emet la Yaakov and Chesed la Avraham, right? Which again, I don't know about Chesed, but it's translated as loyalty because they wanted Emet and Chesed to be paralleled, but Emet is truth, right, or faith, and Chesed is loving kindness. So Emet la Yaakov, truth or faith to Yaakov, or maybe even loyalty, and loving kindness to Abraham is really the connotation. But we use the word chesed ve'emet together a lot, which are loving kindness and truth, as other principles of Jewish values, of divine values, values that God has, which are truth and loving kindness. Sometimes there were chesed ve'emet societies were actually the societies for burial. Actually, it was kind of like it was used as a euphemism for burial societies, chesed ve'emet societies. Now we'll have different kinds of burial societies that that kind of that are that we use for we use for, like Chevra Kadisha, which means like, brothers of, or comrades of holiness. We don't use the word death in these, we euphemistically don't use the word death in these kinds of times. So a lot of times people will talk about chesed ve'emet when they're talking about death, but taking care of people. But Micah finishes with this because he's telling people, this is God's going to do this because he's promised us that he's going to do it. So this is almost like, again, God's going to deliver on the promise. So it's an interesting way to end. It's partly it's going to happen because God said it's going to happen. God's been telling us it's going to happen, and God's going to do what God said he's going to be doing all along. So there is that kind of, that's how it's going to happen. But again, I think the qualities of Micah that kind of stick out are, he says a lot of what you see in especially in Isaiah, but he just does it much quicker. And he, it's a little jarring sometimes because he jumps around so much, but it's all there. I mean, it's all of these concepts that we talk about, almost all of them are there. He just does it in a lot less lines. And again, we don't know much about him. As we said, the only thing we really know about Micah is where he came from. I mean, I mentioned this. We don't even know his last name. I mean, this is all we knew about. This is all we knew about Micah. Micah was Moreshite. He was from Moresha. So, and we know when he lived, but other than that, we don't know anything else about him. So, he definitely is a man of fewer words, but very, very powerful words. And as we finish his book, we say, Tam v'neshalem tehillah le'el borei olam. We give thanks and praise to God, the creator of everything. But next week, as we go through the prophets, you're going to see next week, we're going to read from the prophet Nahum, who's very, very short. And then we're going to be reading from the prophet who's also very short, Habakkuk, which is also 3 chapters. So you can see Micah is kind of the almost dead average of the chapters of the minor prophets. It's 7 chapters. He's kind of like overall average of the minor prophets. He's almost like, the average is like 6 chapters or 5 chapters, 6 chapters. So he's pretty much like right about almost the average length. But the prophets that we're going to be reading coming up, a lot of them are very, very short. I'll just show you. And that's, again, a chance for us to see these prophets for in their totality, and also, again, what they have in common, how they're different. But you can see right here, here's what we just finished, about 15 verses per chapter. The rest of them are all pretty close to that, like, around 15 to 18, whatever, around that area. But look at these next prophets that we read, 3, 3, 3, 2 chapters. And then we get to Zechariah, who's the longest, like tied with Hosea for 14 chapters. But most of these other chapters are about 3 that are coming up. And that's why the average comes out to, I think it says it somewhere around there. Was it their average was about 6 chapter, about, I don't know, whatever, 5.8 chapters for those who are into statistics. So thank you everybody for
Could I just say a few minutes that this is Joe Rinson's yard site, and he was a member of the
that's
Torah.
right. Thank you, Gail. Thank you, Gail. We were looking at pictures. We saw the pictures of Joe that were posted up. So definitely thank you for doing that. We'll reminding us about that. I was thinking about him. We were thinking about that last night. We were just talking about Joe, looking at those old pictures. So thank you for reminding us.
Yeah, he was a handsome guy.
He's a good
He
guy,
was.
right?
Yes, he
We
was.
studied,
Man.
we
He
studied
was.
with him. We studied with him for a long time,
Yeah.
and thank you for reminding us of that. And
Yeah.
we dedicate our study today to him. Okay,
Yes. Thank you.
absolutely. Somebody else was going to say something too.
I was just gonna ask if we're gonna have class after First Seder that Tuesday.
Yes, we are, and we are going to. Just so you know, everybody, we have all classes till the end of the month are in person, except for the 30th, the week after. That last week we don't have class the 30th. I'll be out of town on the 30th, so we don't have class virtually or online. But the next couple of weeks, the 9th, the 16th, and the 23rd will be virtual and in person. We'll be at the temple the next 3 weeks, and then
But the 30th, no Torah study on the 30th.
on the 30th, but every other week in person and online. So mention that too for housekeeping. Thank you, everybody. Enjoy the month of
everyone.
April, and Hag Sameach. We'll start wishing everybody happy Passover too.
That's
Okay,
all.
3 weeks. Take care.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.
Bye.